And God is inviting us. I think He's calling us today to be more engaged in loving our neighbors than we ever have before. It's interesting what's happening in the U.S. today. We're seeing more and more cultural drift away from any kind of biblical truth or any kind of moral absolutes. In fact, we live in kind of a free-for-all society. Whatever you want to do is okay, as long as we all just get along with each other. And the church today is losing ground. Now, there are churches like Parkview that are having incredible influence and growth, but the truth is the Big C church in America, we're at the lowest attendance we've ever had in America as they measure attendance. Commitment from people who say we're Christ followers is as low as it's ever been. And we have almost zero voice in what's happening going around us in the world. At LifeBridge, we would say it this way. There's a stream that's been running by the front door of our church, and we didn't like what was happening in that stream. There's chunks of stuff, and it's gotten muddy and murky. And so what has the church done over the last 6 or 7 decades in America? We backed up out of the church, and we created our own stream kind of behind the church. We didn't like what was going on in public schools, so we started our own Christian schools. We didn't like what was happening in music, so we got Christian music. We didn't like what was going on in business organizations, so we started Christian business clubs. And we got Christian everything today. You know, we got Christian music and Christian books and Christian underwear and Christian breath mints, and we got all of it. And yet, we're having very little influence in what's happening because I think God is inviting us to get in that stream going by the front door, and that's a risky thing. For us to find ways to love God, to gather like this. And I love when we gather, and gathering is a command of God, and it's important, and I'm grateful that you're here, and I hope you'll continue to plug in because we get encouraged here, we honor God here, we lift up Christ, we worship together. But also, when we scatter, how are we living with grace? Are we really loving our neighbors? And so this expert in the law who comes to Jesus says to him, well, exactly who is my neighbor? You know, if he's an attorney, he's going to look for the fine print in the contract. And I want to know if I'm going to love my neighbor, I ought to know, is it everybody that lives in the same city I do? How about everybody that's in my HOA or in my cul-de-sac? Who is my neighbor exactly? And Jesus tells this story, a very familiar story, the Good Samaritan. I'm not going to reread it for you. Let me just kind of capsulize it. There's a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he gets mugged on the way. He gets robbed, left on the road, half beaten. He's dead, almost dead, and naked and bleeding. And Jesus tells a story that a priest comes by. And who's the priest? The priest is kind of the guy with the corner market on the love God, love your neighbor thing, right? He's the one that should have this down. He's the one that ought to figure out how he loves his neighbor. And the priest sees this guy, and he goes by on the other side. And then a Levite comes, and a Levite was like a biblical scholar, someone who knew the scriptures, almost like maybe a theologian or a professor, a teacher. Again, the corner market on God, the one who ought to know the whole commandment about loving God and loving your neighbor, kind of the one that ought to be showing up out there and doing it, and he sees this guy and he passes by on the other side. And then as Jesus tells the story, he says, and then comes a Samaritan. Now, if you remember, Samaritans and Jews hated each other. In fact, if you were in the marketplace and a Samaritan walked by you and their shadow ran across your feet somehow, you were unclean. You couldn't hang out with your family for a whole day. They hated each other. And it's the Samaritan who sees this guy and he helps him out and takes care of him. And Jesus says, now there's my idea of a good neighbor. Now, early on for me, I used to give a hard time to the priest and Levite because they kind of represented the church. And I saw the church being so disconnected and disengaged and ignoring the needs until I recognized that I asked a question that they were asking and that our church often asked a question that the priest and the Levite were asking. And here's that question. What's going to happen to me if I stop to help? I mean, what's going to happen if maybe I'll get mugged. Maybe I'll get off my agenda. Maybe I really can't love God or love my neighbor if I stop to help this guy. I'm on my way to my small group to talk about loving God and loving neighbors. I can't help this dude out here. And the Samaritan asked an entirely different question. The Samaritan was saying, what's going to happen to this guy if I don't stop and help? And when our church started down that path 15 or 16 years ago, it did a number of things for us. And not all of them were easy. But it forced us to start paying attention to not only what was going on inside our walls, but what was happening outside of our walls. And were we not just coming to church, but were we being the church in our community? What did that look like? So there's a couple things this Good Samaritan did that I want to just give them to you. The real practical stuff that every one of us could start doing this afternoon. Look down in verse 33, the very first thing he did. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. When he saw this guy, he took pity on him. In other words, he opened up his eyes, he saw the need, and that word pity means he had compassion or deep sympathy for this man. I was amazed at how often I did not see some of the stuff going on around our community. How often, unfortunately, that I sized people up. And I placed a value on them based on some external thing, either something I cared about or the way they looked or acted or some behavior that I either liked or didn't like. I was amazed at how often I didn't even actually see people, just looked right through them.